I am Jim Morter. I am an architect. I was an architect in Colorado for 39 years. I'm currently residing in Austin, Texas. I went through high school in Albuquerque, and somewhere along the line I had determined that I wanted to be an architect. I don't know how that happened. I didn't know any architects. I'd never been in an architect's office. I drew a lot and was fascinated by architecture. So I went to Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. They had a wonderful architecture program. I think they still do, but part of the reason was they told me that if I qualified, I could get $50 a semester to play on their golf team. And that didn't hurt either. Maybe ego more than anything. I never did see the $50 because I didn't qualify. And I was not smart enough or good enough golfer to do both, so I focused on architecture. If you've been to Lubbock, you know that you don't necessarily want to stay in Lubbock. We wanted to come to Colorado. This was 1968, like I said. And in June of 1968, no one was hiring in Colorado. It was one of the down times. So we simply said, okay, where would we like to live for a few years while we hopefully can get back to Colorado? The equivalent of Google in those days was going to the library and researching, but I researched some firms in Hawaii, contacted a wonderful firm, Wimberly, Wisnant, Allison, and Tong. They were called then. Now it's Wimberly, Allison, Tong, and Gu. They're worldwide resort architects. And got them to hire me sight unseen for $3 an hour. I got a totally distorted view of what life as an architect will be when I was with Wimberly. I was one of their designers, and they really pampered their designers. If we had brain lock, we would just go down to the beach and have a pineapple milkshake and relax and come back and get back to it. But it was interesting because I had in my mind a way that I wanted to practice architecture. Wimberly's 50-person firm was not it, but I did get to do design work on exotic resort projects throughout the South Seas. I got a position with Cliff Nakata and Don Higginbotham and Rob Muir in Colorado Springs, and I had always been in contact with my real mentor, John Anderson. We were trying, and Ron Rinker, we were trying to get together. They weren't hiring in '68, weren't necessarily hiring in '70, but a big school bond issue was coming up, and if it came through, they would be interested in hiring me. And the school bond issue was successful, and so I ended up with then Anderson, Barker, Rinker. They have since divided into two wonderful firms. But that's how I got to Denver. A very good friend of John Anderson's, a wonderful gentleman, Harold Carver, was a small architectural practice in Arvada. And he somehow got hooked into Vail and designed their city hall and their golf clubhouse and what else? A few homes in the area. And he wanted someone to manage a branch office in Vail. And so Andy put me in touch with Harold, and we were ready for a little more adventure than we thought we were finding in Denver. So we took our 6-week-old daughter and drove over Vail Pass in the middle of winter and moved to Vail. I just count myself as extremely lucky. I mentioned earlier that I had rolled around in my mind how I wanted to practice architecture, and Vail gave me that opportunity. Harold decided within a year that he wanted back out of Vail, so I bought Harold's 2 drafting tables, his conference table, took over his lease and his phone number, and became Morter Architects. Vail only started in '62, and it had really been nothing more than a resort town, and people working there were all resort-oriented. When I hung out the Morter architect shingle, I doubled the number of architects in Vail from 1 to 2. And my first real piece of architecture was the sewage treatment plant in Frisco, Colorado. This is not what I would recommend to young architects as a way to start a practice, but I read in the newspaper that Frisco was going to do a 100-foot diameter sewage treatment plant. Basically, it's a steel in the ground plant, and the paddles whirl around inside. I went to the district meeting, stood up, and told them for $88,000, I will give you a custom designed structure for your sewage treatment plant, including my fee. And if we spend less than $88,000, you can keep it and spend it on landscaping. And I worked with Arch Archuleta from JVA, Johnson, Boyle and Archuleta, to come up with a slick little scheme that looked like a shingle flying saucer had landed next to Lake Dillon. We won a National Design Award with this $88,000 sewage treatment plant. And I got to say, I was way too young to have been doing all of this. I was 28 years old when I started it. Luckily, nobody got hurt. Nothing fell down. But it was a very perilous time financially, but I haven't had that much fun in the 38 years since. I did not graduate from Texas Tech Architecture College in order to run a business. I graduated to do architecture. And in a small community like that, I was able to really do architecture, and it became a fault later on when I started. I ended up with as many as 18 people at one point and no strong business direction at all. But I was still involved with the architecture that came out of the office on every project. And so I think, you know, if I'd been in Denver, I don't know if I'd have been able to pull it off. 3 come to mind. One is a name you probably wouldn't recognize. Her name is Tilly Jones, and she is the direct heir to the De Beers diamond mine fortune. She lives in Bermuda, and she walked into the office one day in a t-shirt, cutoffs, flip-flops, a big overweight, hair messed up, cigarette hanging out of her mouth, but she had this extremely proper British accent, and asked for Mr. Morter. And I didn't take her too seriously. We went in the conference room, and I told her to put out her cigarette. Turns out, she mentioned a common friend, Fred Green, and so you know, she mentioned that she wanted to do a home. She mentioned a common friend, so I called Fred and said, "What can you tell me about this lady, Tilly Jones?" And he said, "Well, she's you might want to have an ashtray the next time she comes," which I did. She wanted a home reminiscent of the English cottage in which she grew up in England. It was really a contemporary piece of architecture, but it really had all the coziness. Really a neat project. So Tilly Jones was a very interesting client. Ross Perot, he had a lot on Beaver Dam Road, and I don't recall how I got introduced to Ross or why he called me, but he did, and I went to the home that was on the property at the time, which was torn down for the new home. And he met me in a Pendleton shirt with holes in the elbows and looked like he had been to Supercuts to get his hair cut. And he is one of the cheapest people I've ever known. But he was fun. He was a Jekyll and Hyde. You never knew who you were going to get. He could be so endearing. And he could be such a horse's ass that, you know, just at the click of a finger. But it was a lot of fun. It was fun. His wife is a jewel. She kept everything going. Jack Nicklaus, the golfer, is another one for whom I did a home. He wanted a log home. I had never done a log home before, and this was an 8,000 square foot log home. It's not a cabin. Never done one, but we got through it. It was really a good building. He designed a course in the Vail Valley called Country Club of the Rockies. And if you know anything about Nicklaus's golf courses, the greens, and he was at his peak at this time, were just crazy humps and bumps and buried elephants. And the worst of the greens was number 17. So I'm sitting at his home in Florida with him and Barbara, and we're sketching some ideas. Some idea came up, I don't remember what it was. He said, God, that is the worst thing I've ever seen. Why the hell would you even show that to me? And he just went on and on and on. And I said, well, Jack, why don't we just call that my number 17 green at Country Club of the Rockies? And not a smile. Just Barbara had to get up and leave the table. She was laughing so hard. But Jack didn't see the humor in that. But we've remained very good friends to this day. And so that was a real opportunity for me. I'm a golf nut. And then Jerry Ford. We did the Ford Amphitheater in Vail. The thing I remember most about Jerry Ford was in the early days of my being in Vail, I did cartoons for the local weekly newspaper at $15 a pop. Jerry had just become vice president, and I did a cartoon about him on a chairlift with a bunch of FBI guys hanging off the chair and a couple of skiers saying, well, looks like Vice President Ford is skiing today. The next day, 2 Secret Service guys show up in my office and ask for Mr. Morter. I said, well, I'm Mr. Morter, and he said, you know, Jerry just loved that cartoon. Would you give him a signed copy of it? Well, I gave him the signed original. Got to have breakfast with him and Betty and his family, and we stayed very close until he really started losing it. He was not really that much with it. It was about his last year, but a wonderful guy, as sincere and down-to-earth a guy, you know, as he projected. He really was that kind of person. So that's some of my name dropping. A fellow you interviewed earlier, John Rogers, he decided Colorado didn't have enough fellows back then, and he really lit a fire under the chapters to come up with nominations. So I thank John, because I don't think I would have ever submitted on my own. I was there at the right time and had some good people helping me. But I mean, my reference letters were President Ford, Jack Nicklaus. Lassie, golly, I miss Lassie. Lassie was a 125-pound potbelly pig that we had for, golly, 17 years. We went through 3 cats and 2 dogs during Lassie's life. I got a great Lassie story that pertains to architecture, though. I was in a conference room with a husband and wife. We were doing their home. Lassie was in my office, and on the floor I had a soft briefcase with a couple of Velcro tabs on it. And Lassie at this point was probably less than a year old. And at that point, her hair was stubbly, kind of a long Velcro length, bristly hair. So we're in the conference room, and all of a sudden I hear furniture banging and Lassie squealing and screaming. She came bolting out of my office with my briefcase Velcroed to her right hip. But she quit coming to the office when she started eating architectural models. We had to leave her at home. I think architects hit their stride in their 60s in terms of what they can really do. And I'm 67. But by the same token, I'm kind of worn out with it. And unless I get a wonderful project with someone I thoroughly enjoy as a client and a wonderful fee, I am not going to keep slugging rats. I'm going to be much less of a presence. I'm going to work more with, spend more time with AIA Austin, spend more time sketching and painting, which I couldn't wait to get out of school so I'd have enough time to do, and now I wish I was back in school so I had enough time to do it. But so I'll have plenty to do. I do have trouble with the thought of not producing architecture because I feel like I say, I think I've just been hitting my stride over the last few years in terms of what I can do, but I'll do it for the right people at the right time. But otherwise, I'm not going to bang my head on the wall. I had an architect here in Denver who worked at ABR tell me about 6 months ago, he said, "You know, Jim, if we had gotten together and I ran a business and you did the architecture, we'd be on Architectural Record magazine every 6 months and yada yada." And that got me thinking, have I frittered away too much by staying smaller and doing homes instead of more, quote, significant, important architecture? And I don't know. There's that possibility. Although, I don't know, I had made up my mind before I was 30 years old the way I wanted to practice architecture, and it wasn't what he suggested, at all. It's more what I did.